You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring scripture with Dr. T. Michael W. Halcomb and Dr. Fredrick J. Long. Welcome and enjoy.
Hello and welcome to Proof Text. I'm Michael Halcomb. I'm here with Fred Long, and this is a grammar point episode. And we're still thinking about verbs. We've been talking about verbs for a long time now. We're still thinking about verbs, and in today's episode, in particular, we're thinking about aorist verbs. Aoristos chronos. Oh, I forgot in the previous one, Fred, to give the Greek term for imperfect. And is that paratatikos chronos? I'm pretty sure that's what it is. Paratatikos chronos. Forgive me if I'm wrong, y'all, but I think that's what it is. Paratatikos chronos. So the aorist would just be aoristos chronos. Yeah, so it's basically a transliteration into English. Aorist is.
Yeah, and we're that's helpful. I think we're mainly describing these from the perspective of the indicative mood, like some of the endings that we'll provide. I think we can go on and talk about the other moods later, but just to clarify, we're looking particularly at the aorist in terms of the indicative mood. The aorist tense conveys what's called perfective aspect, which views the event as a whole, complete or completed, kind of depends a little bit on context, but it views the action as a whole. From the context, it may be that the action is at the start or maybe at the end. And this gets into different uses, perhaps, action sart, pragmatic uses, but generally conveys the perfective aspect. Now, in the indicative mood, there's two formations. There's the sigma alpha, or first aorist formation, and then there's the second aorist formation. Let's talk about the first aorist, sigma alpha. So you have an augment added, that epsilon added, and that will sneak behind any preposition or adverbial prefixes to the verb and attach to the front of the verb stem. Now, this aorist tense is part of the third principal part, and when you move from first to second to third principal part, there's potential for a stem change. So the stem may slightly change from what you learn as the lexical form, which is the present form, present tense form. So there may be a stem change. So you get an augment added to a stem, and then you have a sigma alpha typically in the ending for the first aorist. So you have sa, sas, se, or sen, and then plural samen, sate, san. And so that's the active formation. The middle formation is also found here. Samein, so, sato, samastha, saste, santo. Okay, the aorist passive, and we can debate that a little bit when we get there, is formed separately in what's called the sixth principal part. We'll talk about that later. So third principal part has the aorist active and middle formation. So that was the first aorist, formed with sigma alphas. There is a second aorist formation, and the good news, and there's good news and bad news about the second aorist. The good news is that the endings are exactly the same as the imperfect tense. On es e, omen ete on, for the active, for the middle, omen u eto, ometha este onto. So that's the good news. The good news is it uses exact same imperfect endings. The bad news is that it uses the exact same imperfect endings. And that can be confusing. So the difference between imperfect as a parsing versus the aorist is that you're going to have a stem change. That stem change is what's going to help you identify the second aorist. So the second aorist is formed with an augment, and then a stem change, and then the imperfect endings. The first and second aorist are translated the same. They're viewing the event as a whole. There's no difference between the first and second aorist. The second aorist verbs tend to be older verbs, a little bit more basic in meaning, like see and take and receive and eat and say, did I say, no. So these verbs, you can imagine in a language, are used a lot, and they tend to be older verbs, and they they've had more change over time. And so that's kind of one interesting thing about the second aorist verbs. How many are there in use in the New Testament? Well, I learned them as the dirty dozen, but there's probably more like the dirty 2 dozen of them.
Mm,
So there's about 2 dozen of them. When you learn
yeah.
them, you need to learn their second aorist stem. But it's very
Mm.
doable. And so, yeah, that's about it for the first and second aorist formation, third principal
So
part.
this is interesting though, like um, to equate perfective aspect with the aorist tense. So if you read David Allen Black's Learn to Read New Testament Greek, he describes it differently. I've always I've followed his path on that, which is he describes the aorist tense as having aoristic aspect,
Hmm.
the imperfect tense as having imperfective aspect, and the perfect tense as having perfective aspect, where the aorist tense is unmarked and it's sort of focusing on the emphasizing the verbal idea. The imperfect or imperfective aspect is marked and emphasizing a process, as we kind of were talking about in the previous episode, and perfective aspect is marked and emphasizing results or effects. So it's
Yeah,
kind of
yeah. I really respect David Allen Black, but he might happen to be wrong on this point. No, um, I guess languages across the world, like linguists say, there's only two main verbal aspects. So there's no such thing as an aoristic aspect, I think, is what they would respond. Um, and I probably would default to that. Um, but then the perfect tense, and it gets confusing in nomenclature. One person has described it in this book edited by Stephen Runge and Christopher Fresh called The Greek Verb Revisited. The contributor there, and forgive me for not mentioning his name, I can't remember, but he calls the perfect tense the combinative aspect because it
was that Mike
combines
Aubrey?
maybe it combines the imperfective, like kind of ongoingness, but then it views it as a whole at the end, like the results. So it kind of combines both. And really the endings, when we look at the endings, you can kind of say, yeah, it uses middle passive present tense endings, but then it uses kind of aorist tense like active endings. So there may be something to that. The endings seem to be merging these as well. But in any case, verbal aspect is a tricky field, but we need
Yeah,
to, be aware of it. And
yeah,
yeah, that's the current understanding. Is there's two main verbal aspects, and
yeah.
the aorist tense represents the perfective aspect.
That cross linguistic stuff is always important, but uh, sometimes we have to not let the cross linguistic perspective override what we find in one language.
Yeah,
Because that language may have its own thing, right? So, but yeah.
yeah,
So, anyways, just bringing that up.
yeah.
Uh,
That's helpful. Thanks.
yeah, it's worth knowing. So, all right, yeah. Thanks, Fred. Appreciate that. We hope this helps.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.